Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is the review guide for the Anatomy and Physiology test on Chapter 5, Histology or Tissues. It's a pretty short chapter. It's going to require you to be able to identify all the slides and locate them and their distribution in the body and talk a little bit about their function. So we're made up of a couple different types of tissues. It's not that complicated. Four major tissue types: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. And we get the four C's. Epithelial covers, connective tissue connects, muscle contracts, and nerve tissue communicates. Epithelia is the stuff that covers it. It always has a free surface and then a surface that's connected to something called the membrane, basement membrane. It lines your body cavities, it covers all your organs, covers your body itself. These cells are undergoing rapid cell division. Often they're very tightly packed. Some of them have structures called desmosomes that allow them to become really tight and just seal you off from the outer world, and that's a big role for epithelium. They are avascular. That means they don't have blood vessels. They protect you, they secrete, they absorb, and they excrete. And the way we identify them is on the basis of their cell shape and the number of layers. Single layers, one layer cells is called simple, and more than one is stratified. The simple squamous is our first tissue type. You can see that this is made up of one layer of flat cells. You find these in the alveoli of the lungs and in the capillaries in your blood vessels. So this type of tissue also lines the interior of all your major blood vessels. There's lots of places where you might find simple squamous epithelium, but remember, lungs and capillaries. And of course, since it's one layer and it's really flat, it's really easy for gases like oxygen and CO2 to pass just right through the membrane. Remember that CO2 and oxygen are nonpolar, and they're small, and so they can diffuse according to their concentration gradient. In the lungs, I've got lots of oxygen, relatively speaking, and so oxygen diffuses out of the lungs into the capillaries where the blood's deoxygenated. And of course, in the blood, there's lots of CO2, so it diffuses back in the lungs, and this is how we do gas exchange. Next, simple cuboidal. When you think of simple cuboidal or cuboidal in general, think about glands and think about the kidney tubules. Kidneys have these really fascinating structures called the nephrons, and they're made up of these cuboidal tissues. Kidneys, of course, are involved in filtering your blood and actually passing stuff back and forth from the blood to the kidney nephron and back again. You also find simple cuboidal lining the ducts of glands. And that's it for simple cuboidal. Next are simple columnar. And simple columnar lines the stomach, the small intestines, and even the uterus. Often they are ciliated. Sometimes they have microvilli. So let's talk about those two examples. In the uterus, the simple columnar tissues have cilia. And of course, those cilia are tiny little hair-like structures on the cells, and they move mucus around, and they hopefully are going to move an egg to be fertilized. In the small intestine, think of the small intestine as a long, 25-foot long tube, but it's not smooth inside. In fact, there's tiny little finger-like projections of tissue called villi. And those villi are actually made up of tiny little simple columnar cells that have their own tiny little finger-like projections called microvilli. And again in anatomy and physiology, we'll see examples of how surface anatomy, or the surface area of the anatomy, is maximized in order to allow for exchange. And of course, your small intestine's job is to exchange materials with the world, get some food in, and so you've got lots and lots of surface area to do that. Next is pseudostratified columnar, and it's pseudostratified because if you look at the distribution of the nuclei in pseudostratified columnar cells, you'll see that they're in odd places. Compare them with the simple columnar nuclei. They're the little blue dots in the diagram or the purple dots in the slide. And one of the things, and you'll see when we look at some stratified tissues, is that you can kind of identify stratified tissues by the location of nuclei. In the case of simple tissues, we see the nuclei all lined up, just like you see in the simple columnar. Pseudostratified looks like there's different layers, but there's just one. In both simple columnar and pseudostratified, you see these gap cells. Of course, they're the goblet cells. They make mucus. And pseudostratified columnar is what you find in the respiratory passageways. Pseudostratified columnar is ciliated. It's a mucous membrane, and of course the cilia in your lungs is beating up that mucus to get it out of your lungs. And of course mucus's role is to trap particulate matter and infectious vectors or agents like bacteria or viruses or even parasites or amoeboid. Remember, don't get a bird. Next, our epithelial tissues is stratified squamous. Stratified squamous is the stuff that makes up your skin. See how many layers there are. See those nuclei distributed up and down. This is what makes up your skin. And remember that all epithelial tissues have a free surface and then a part of them that's attached to the basement membrane. Free surface up top, basement membrane down bottom here. And you might look down at these cells and say, hey, wait a minute, Mr. Doherty, these cells aren't squamous here, they're cuboidal. And well, we'd actually identify all the epithelial tissues by the shape of the cells that are closest to the free surface. So out here, the outer layer of skin, you have this cornified layer of tissue. It's actually called the stratum corneum. And as these cells age, they move up and they start making keratin. And they start to get desiccated. They lose their cell fluid until finally all that keratin welds together and you got this corny layer. My daughter says I'm corny. I know I am. And I'm also ashy. And when I scratch those cells, I make dust. Of course, 90% of the stuff that is dust in your house is dead skin. And that outer layer actually gets covered with oils from your sebaceous glands to make you waterproof, all right? And so that stratified squamous epithelium is really important in keeping water out and keeping water in and keeping stuff out, right? Next, stratified cuboidal. Remember, when I say cuboidal, you think glands, and these are the cells that line the glands of the mammary glands, sweat glands, salivary glands, and the pancreas. We'll talk a little bit about them in detail in a minute. Next, stratified columnar. This is the weirdo, right? It's distributed, it's stratified, it's columnar, so kind of hard to identify, but it's easy to talk about its distribution. It's in the vas deferens, right? The male urethra, and then part of the pharynx. That's the back of your throat. So all these things have to stretch a lot, and so that's maybe the characteristic that gives us stratified columnar epithelium, which brings us to our last epithelial tissue, the transitional tissue. And this is Doc's favorite, right? Because it lines the urinary bladder. Remember, if you've got a scrunchie, you understand the distribution of cells in the transitional epithelium, right? Looks like there's lots of layers here, but when I stretch it out, those layers flatten out. It's actually only a few layers thick, but the function of transitional epithelium is to stretch. Hence, you find it in the urinary bladder. So there you go. 8 tissues to memorize. Pretty easy to do. Some are super easy to identify, others not so much. Next is our glands, and glands are all made up of epithelium. 2 types of glands, the endocrine and the exocrine glands. Endocrine glands, I've got a little handout for you guys to work on, and of course they include the pituitary, the thyroid, the parathyroids, pancreas, your gonads, etc. And you'll learn a little bit about them. They don't have any ducts. On the other hand, those exocrine glands that we're familiar with, like our sweat glands, the salivary glands, your mammary glands, the ceruminous glands that make wax in your ears, are made up of, have ducts that, remember, are lined with what kind of epithelium? Stratified cuboidal. I don't care if you know the structures of exocrine glands, although this guy down here is what we'll see in our sebaceous glands, or maybe a little bit like this too. But I do want you to know this. Remember, in terms of bad to worse, it's MAH, M-A-H. We have merocrine glands, and these guys are just secreting a fluid product. The apocrine glands secreting a fluid product plus cell parts, and then last but not least are the holocrine glands. These secrete stuff and whole cells. Your sebaceous glands, those things that give you zits, are the holocrine glands. The apocrine glands are the weirdos, okay? So they're dumping cell parts, but they're the guys that make milk, the mammary glands, or they make wax, the ceruminous glands, or the apocrine sweat glands, which are different from the merocrine sweat glands. So most of your body's sweat glands are merocrine glands, also called eccrine glands, right? And you see them as the sweat glands of the pancreas. Salivary glands are merocrine. But down here, this apocrine glands, the apocrine sweat glands are weird because they actually make sort of a waxy exudate, and they are distributed in your armpits and around your genitals. And you actually communicate with other animals through these compounds called pheromones, all right? So whether you're aware of it or not, you're just quietly and silently and smellingly communicating with your neighbors through the apocrine sweat glands. Remember that. Next, connective tissues. Connective tissues do a lot of things. I think one of the most salient features of the connective glands is that they are composed of living cells that are suspended in an inorganic matrix. What does that mean? Well, in the case of like blood, which is a connective tissue, weirdly, I've got red blood cells and white blood cells, and then it's floating in serum, which is essentially water. Okay, so water's inorganic, like bone as well. So bone has living cells suspended in a crystalline structure called hydroxyapatite, right? So the hydroxyapatite is inorganic, although it does change over time. Same thing's true with tendons, and of course, one of the weird things about these connective tissues, you can take cadavers, connective tissues, and you can use them because if you clean them out right. There's a lot of functions associated with the connective tissues. They bind things, they protect us, they fill spaces, they store fat, they make blood cells. You know, in the case of the blood system or bones, we have lots of blood vessels. But when it comes to dense regular tissues like tendons and ligaments, very little vascular elements, which means it takes a long time for them to heal. If you have ever had one of those injuries, you know. All connective tissues have these three major types of cells. Fibroblasts, blast means to make, fibro means fibers. These fibroblasts make fibers. We'll talk about that in a second. Next are the mast cells. These guys are associated with the immune response. They are fixed in the tissues, and they release heparin and histamine. Now look, you know what happens when you take an antihistamine. It reduces inflammation, right? Histamine causes inflammation. What is inflammation characterized by? Well, swelling through edema. This fluid collection or edema is the result of the opening of blood vessels, vasodilation, okay? So another characteristic of inflammation is vasodilation, which causes fluid to collect in that area, and it also causes that tissue to become red. It also causes that tissue to become hot. And it also could sometimes cause pain or itching, right? So if you have inflammation, you might be uncomfortable. You might feel a little hot and red and swollen up, all right? Histamine. Next is heparin. If you have a grandparent and they're covered with bruises, they're probably taking heparin. It's an anticoagulant as a therapy. That is, it's an antithrombolytic. It stops blood from clotting. But in vivo, its purpose is poorly understood. And in fact, it points to the fact that maybe heparin really starts the coagulation process in adjunct with inflammation. So when you get an injury, you have the mast cells release histamine, which causes inflammation. They also release heparin, which probably causes that blood in that area to start to clot or not. I don't know, but you can read up on it if you're interested. Next are the macrophages. These are wandering cells. They're phagocytic. They eat other stuff, and they're really important in your defense, right? So the leukocytes, your killer T cells, your killer B cells are running around looking for trouble, and you'll see them when we study your immune system. There's three types of connective tissue fibers. The collagenous fibers are big and thick. They've got great tensile strength, so it's hard to break them. The reticular fibers are narrow. They're made of the protein actin, which is important in the muscular structure. And then we have the elastic fibers, which are elastic, and you find them in tissues that have a lot of elastic character. There are 8 connective tissues. First is the loose connective tissue. Lots of big collagen fibers, lots of gel-like matrix,